Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast. I'm your host, Jobin Varghese, and we are excited to bring you another episode. And I'm joined with my fellow colleagues, Alvin, Mathew, and Toby Kurian, where we discuss some of the experiences that the Asian American community has had to deal with over the past year and some of the negative incidents and comments that have been made towards that community. And so we hope you enjoy this episode and can relate to some of the experiences that our community has had to deal with. And so before we get into that, we just wanted to say thank you. We just celebrated our 16th year anniversary with Rock, and it's been amazing to see how God has been so faithful and just connecting our communities together. And we hope this podcast has been just one of those avenues where we can shine a spotlight on the folks who are doing their part to restore our cities. And one of the ways that we want to celebrate that is by using a new feature on our Anchor website. If you go to anchor.fm/restoringourcity, you can actually leave us a message, and we love to hear from you. You can actually leave an anonymous voicemail, and we could possibly use that on a future episode. So we'd love to hear your questions, your ideas, or topics that you love for us to discuss, and just share that with us, or maybe even just feedback about the podcast. And we'd love to connect with you, hear from you, and maybe even use it on a future episode as well. So check that out, anchor.fm/restoringourcity, and leave us a message. But we hope you enjoy this episode, and feel free to engage with us on our social media handles at Restoring Our City on Facebook and Instagram. And you can find us on Twitter as well at The Rock Podcast. Find all that information on our website at restoringourcity.org. Thanks again for listening. Excited that it's summer, and I know we've been kind of a little bit more sporadic with our episodes. We got obviously things going on with an easier, lighter summer schedule, but that doesn't stop things happening in the news and things impacting our community. I think there's a lot going on, and I definitely wanted to connect with you guys, especially this week, on some topics. I think there's lots going on to impact the Asian community as well, and I wanted to talk to you guys about one of these recent incidents. And this is something that's been happening in our society for a while. We've all heard, the uptick in violence against the Asian American community. And I think when it originally started to happen in, March, April, I saw a lot of folks putting out episodes and content and things like that. It's like, that knee-jerk reaction to talk about things. And I reached out to some folks, actually. I started to talk to people in the Asian American community and like some leaders, and it's a real thing. It's a real problem, but I wanted to learn about it. And one thing about like podcasts and all this content creation, it's so easy to just like, hey, I'm going to give you my initial reaction without reading or listening. And so I wanted to take some time to actually like listen and read things, but it just there's things that keep coming up in the news. So I want to pause there. What was your reaction, guys? Maybe Alvin, starting with you, like when you started to hear some of the stuff in the news about violence against the Asian American communities, what kind of ran through your head?
Dude, it's, there's a couple of things. I've only seen I haven't seen everything, but of the few things I kind of see forwarded on like Facebook or even just sometimes highlighted on the news, you see a lot of like violence against Asian Americans who are actually like the elderly, and they're just like minding their own business. Like I think I saw a couple, there was like one in New York where like a dude like basically pushed over just this grandma in front of her store just for no reason. And like you see all this like random stuff that it's like, that's like it's tough to see, because I mean, obviously we like, being Asian American or, South Asian American, whatever it is, that, we kind of identify a little bit with it, but it's like, it's pretty bad. And speaking more like with the Pacific Islander hate we've seen more recently, especially after the whole coronavirus, it's been crazy. Just, I know that there's been like, even against just regular Asian, like South Asian American violence, where like they were mistake for people of color, like African Americans, but they were elderly, didn't know English. I think we have a couple of stories of that as well, where it's just like, this is, just terrible. I don't know. I'm even having trouble like explaining it, like it's really just bad.
It's definitely been on the rise. So yeah, it's been pretty crazy.
So that's the thing, right? Like, has it been on the rise? Like, or has it always been happening? Because it's always like, I feel like, when even like, when we're younger and things like it was always just kind of like funny to make fun of Asian folks, South Asians, as well as, East Asians, right? Like it was just like a funny thing. And it was never like taken seriously, like if somebody like, every other like hate incident was taken a little bit more seriously than like the violence or just like hate against Asians. It was almost like funny, you know what I mean? Like and I'm sure like it's not always, but like growing up, I felt that, you know, it was like funny to make fun of the Indian guy with the accent, or you know, the Korean American with, you know, whatever his accent, or you know, just the way, you know, their mannerisms is, or whatever, not right. Like it's just always been like kind of like one of those things where it's like, oh, he's just like an Asian guy, or it's just like it's funny, you know. So I think now, like with everything else, right, we have phones, so we're starting to record it. So people see it more, but I think it's always been there.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting kind of perspective on it. I don't think it excuses that kind of behavior at all, right? Like it doesn't make it right to make fun of those people, right? But I think maybe in our culturally sensitive time frame, whether you know you agree that we're crossing the line there or not, maybe we are starting to get more educated that, hey, those things that we thought were okay to say back then, even though we were joking, maybe it's not okay. It's truly not okay. Maybe that's why it's getting called to the forefront. I think part of it now is just more, we are very sensitive to it now because of the social unrest that's happening in our society. Do you feel like that's part of it too?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's a little bit more aware, a little bit more sensitive to these things, mm-hmm. right? So now it's like, hey, you know, the Asian community is almost like, hey, listen, like we know that you guys think this was funny for a long time, but this is actually pretty serious, you know? And like, it's just kind of like that wave, you know, that's been happening. Like finally the Asian community is kind of standing up and being like, hey, we're part of that, you know, like don't dismiss us just because you guys think it's funny. You know what I mean? Like it's funnier for you. Don't dismiss that. Like we're part of that too, you know, that discrimination that's been happening for so long, and you know, for so long in this country. So I don't know. I think it's just like people are being more aware from every single, you know, standpoint or, you know, perspective.
I do want to read this stat from Pew Research. It said 1 in 5 U.S. Asians cite former President Donald Trump as one of the reasons for the rise in violence against Asian Americans. And it kind of stems into, you know, that's kind of people's opinions and things like that. But you know, I don't want to get into like people's personal opinions, but when we're talking about an uptick in violence, it seems like there's been a little bit more self-reported hate crimes as well. And I was looking at the FBI's hate crime statistics, and they're looking at that, and there's been an increase in self-reported hate crime incidents, especially among the Asian American community. So is it happening? Yes, there is some actual incidents of it happening. And so I wanted to talk about that, especially in light of this past week, where I actually saw this comment from a sports commentator, Stephen A. Smith, and he actually made these comments about Shohei Ohtani, who's an amazing baseball player for the Los Angeles Angels. If you don't know about Shohei Ohtani, he's not only a starting pitcher, but he's also a designated hitter. So like, I'm not gonna like speak to all the baseball fans out there, but like
impressive
they're usually playing.
Is what it is.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
The last person who was doing this at a very successful level was Babe Ruth. So you're like the early 1900s. Right. So like, not only are you a great pitcher, you're a great hitter too, right? So amazing baseball player, and he's like making waves, like in So anyway, Stephen A. Smith made this comment. So he said, I don't think it helps that the number one face is a dude that needs an interpreter so you can understand what the hell he's saying. And he also went out when he actually got some criticism for that statement. And then he doubled down on those comments. And then he said this: if you are a sport trying to integrate yourself with the American public the way Major League Baseball is, because of the problems that you've been having to deal with in terms of improving the attractiveness of the sport, it helps if you spoke the English language. So that's his comments. And he did apologize. We're recording this several days after those comments, and they had a lot of backlash on Twitter. But I wanted to share that with you guys because it's 2021 and someone is saying this on the internet, and he gets paid millions of dollars to have opinions. So what do you think about that when you hear that? If you're a baseball fan or not, like what goes through your head?
I mean, as a huge sports fan, I'm not taking his stand at all, but what he's trying to say is, you know, it's easier, more relatable if the person could speak English. Fine, understand, right? But the thing is, like, if you're such an amazing player and you're doing the things that you're doing, I don't think it really matters because there are plenty of baseball players from the Dominican Republic, as we know, is a huge ground for baseball that do not speak English, and that has never been a problem. But the fact that like this is a problem because he's an Asian American, like that, you know, you're singling someone out. You know what I mean? If you look at boxing, some of the greatest fighters that have ever walked inside that ring have not spoken English. Same thing with the UFC. Anderson Silva is the greatest mixed martial artist. And for a long time, that man did not speak English in the ring. So to say that, I think Stephen A. Smith is definitely picking and choosing who he's blaming for this. You know what I mean?
Interesting. So I'm not a big MMA guy, but I remember Anderson Silva didn't he snap his leg?
Yeah.
Oh,
gross.
Man, disgusting.
Terrible.
That was great for the marketability. I was just like, oh snap, this is what this is about.
Oh snap.
Oh snap, he snapped his leg.
No, that's a good point. So you actually feel like he was singling somebody out because there's other instances of, you know, people who are not natively born in America and grown up here.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to what I was saying before. Like, it's just like there's this weird mindset from the American media and just like Americans in general that it's okay to do that to Asian Americans because there's this like undertone of like it's kind of funny. You know what I mean? Like there is that, and like I have always felt that. You know, when we're growing up, it was always like, oh yeah, you're the uppos of the world. You know what I mean? That's right. You know, the Indian thick Indian accent, or like thick Chinese accent or whatever. It was just kind of funny to make fun of that. You know, that our culture. And I definitely think that, you know, because there's other incidences of champions that in sports who did not speak English, and there was never an issue with that. But all of a sudden, when it's an Asian American, there's an issue with that. You know what I mean? Like there's something there. You're singling someone out because of their culture, you know, and because there's this undertone that it's okay to do.
Yeah, even like this actually reminded me as you're talking about like Toby, as you're mentioning all those different like champions. Like I think it was Chris Rock. This is probably back in the 90s where he goes, "Hey, we live in such a weird time where like, you know, the best golf player in the world is a black dude, and the best rapper in the world is a white guy."
Is a white
and
dude.
It's like, well, technically, like, I mean, to Steven's like his quote or whatever, I think it's just kind of like an uneducated, maybe an ignorant take, because really, like, from his viewpoint, you know, I assume he sees baseball as like an American sport, and so he wants like a Captain America looking dude to be the guy hitting all the home runs and getting all the good stats. But from a more like globalistic standpoint, you should be like, look, this American game of baseball is so great that people from Asian countries are getting in on it, and they love. Like, I think you really missed the mark. That like, dude, you're kind of thinking small-minded here, where if you really want this to like grow in America, like it should be like soccer. Where it's like, no, this could be a global phenomenon where people all around should feel like, hey, I can. If this Asian dude can do it, man, maybe me as an Indian guy, maybe I could become a baseball player. You know, like it should be more encompassing of like, or more inclusive of like, hey, this is awesome. Everyone should be a part of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know what the crazy part is? One of the largest markets for baseball is Japan.
Yeah.
What?
Even I knew that.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, who are you making fun of?
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, like we have, you know, Yao Ming and Ichiro Suzuki, and there's so many like players who have come here. I understand that, like from a marketability standpoint, and Toby, you have obviously that perspective on it when you're talking about trying to grow the game, and I think that's where Stephen A. Smith was trying to like make those comments. But like, especially given the context, right? Like Asian American violence has been on the rise, and you know, looking at the incidents, it's like this is the kind of world that we live in. And then to make those comments, I feel like it added some kind of weight to like, were you tone deaf to like what's actually happening in society, or maybe it's to your point, Toby?
Yeah, I think Stephen A. Smith kind of talks out of his, you know, his rear end a lot too, you know? So I think it was just one of those incidences where he was doing that. and then he just got caught in this, stupidity that he was spitting out. I think like again, right? Like I keep going back to this point, but like we have to like understand that like all sorts of racism, any type of racism, it doesn't matter what the color, or the culture is, like it's wrong, like if you wanna, and going back to the point of like, making baseball a global whatever, a sport. Baseball has a lot of other issues we should focus on. It's honestly, it's a declining sport. I don't want to say a dying sport, but it's a declining sport because of the lack of energy it has. The world is speeding up, and baseball is still a slow grind of a sport. So let's start, let's focus on those things, and not the guy who is just playing baseball out of his mind, and he couldn't speak English. Actually, the thing is, Stephen A is wrong about him not speaking English either, because if you look online, this man has spoken without an interpreter, and he sounds great. He has no issues with it. So I think this is just straight ignorance is what really comes down to.
Yeah, no, I know. I agree. I feel like it is ignorance, because like I was watching his highlights and I'm like captivated, and it kind of reminded me back into like 1998. Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa were in the home run race. For those of you old enough to remember that thing. And growing up in Chicago, Sammy Sosa, before, cork bat and steroids and all that kind of stuff, we're like, man, and Sammy Sosa. But he couldn't speak English very well either. He had a lot of energy and things like that. He didn't use an interpreter, but he didn't speak English as well as maybe Mark McGwire, right? Like a different, but it was the game itself. And so I feel like, are you using this as a crutch or some kind of excuse? And maybe that is a racist comment. Maybe that is something that's just like, wow, you're pinpointing something that maybe to get views and clicks. I don't know what it is, but it seems like it's still wrong and not a great way to empower your community, right? I feel like that's a horrible way to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Writer June Lee, he wrote, telling anyone, let alone a generational, once in a lifetime baseball talent who's currently doing something completely unprecedented to just learn English, completely underestimates and devalues the difficulty of immigrating to the United States. And when he said that, I was like, man, that's our parents.
Yeah.
That's our parents. Like, if you think about the story of our parents, it's a movie, dude. Literally, it's a movie. Absolutely. I don't know why somebody hasn't written a screenplay about this. And like, that's why it bothered me so much. I know this is a stupid sports commentator and it has no weight on my life, but it's just like, but we've grown up with this like stereotype, like you were talking about, Toby, that people were making fun of you. Like, how many Simpsons jokes have you heard in your life?
Yeah, exactly. Right? And, to kind of go off your point, Joby, like this is the other side of the model minority myth. Because usually it's like, oh yeah, the model minority myth, like, oh yeah, they're really successful and educated and all that. But the other side of it is the model minority is supposed to put their head down and just take it. You know what I mean? Like that's the other side of this that we're seeing being exposed now.
How have you guys had to deal with that? I mean, because we are South Asians and we've grown up here for the majority of our life here in America. But how do we have to deal with it? Even
you just said America.
America. Like we were born and brought up here, blowing up fireworks on the 4th of July. You know what I mean? Like, so how does it make you feel when you still get exposed to some of those things, or have you been exposed to some of those kind of comments?
Dude, my name is Toby, and I'm a brown guy. I have had the funniest reactions because there's times where we're on a call, right, and we have never met each other, and then I walk in and they're like, "You're Toby?" I thought your name would be Sanjay. You know what I mean? Like I have walked into so many meetings and there's people just like dumbfounded or shocked. They're like, this, and I always got the follow-up question is, do you have another name? Is this your real name? You know what I mean?
What's your actual name?
And
What's your
pretty
real
unique
name?
in that because like as South Asian, especially Malayali and like being Christian, like we're there. That's like super unique to us because there's Joby, Alvin, Jason, Steve, and then you walk in and they're like, Steve, you're Steve.
That's not your real name.
That's
How
not
many
your real
times have you? So
so
my
many
name.
times. It just
my
happened
God.
to me 3 weeks ago. I was at a mixer and somebody's like, "Oh, what's your name?" I said, "My name is Toby." And the lady looks at me and goes, "What's your
What?
other name?"
What?
And I was like, Toby. That's it. I don't really have anything else.
Do we have to carry our birth certificates around? What's happening?
Oh, I have had people ask me for my license.
What?
Yeah, and not recently, but it has happened where they're like, "Come
dude.
on, let me see your license." I was like, "No, but yes, that's my name."
That's too
No,
funny.
you're actually getting pulled over by a cop. You're like, no.
He's like, "Come on."
Yeah.
I need to see your
Tell me the
license for
truth.
other reasons.
He's like, "What's your real name, kid?" It's like, "Why were you speeding?"
Oh
got
my
an
gosh, I didn't think
imposter.
about that. Alvin, I mean,
Uh-huh.
traditional name, Alvin.
Yeah. Well, so like it's interesting because being like in the engineering tech field, I'm typically surrounded by people who have like a decent level of education or have like seen some level of like outside world experience. And I say this because I did work for a company where we had very, very highly qualified, super intelligent people who like had degrees from world-renowned universities. And we also had people who like just kind of graduated high school and were like working there as well, never left their hometown. And I remember I had a guy who was like, I guess he would have been like a lead salesman or whatever, a little bit older dude. And he asked me, he's like, so like where you know, like where's your family originally from? And I'm like, oh, my parents were, you know, kind of born in India. He's like, but I was born and raised here. And he's like, oh wow, like I can barely tell, like you don't have an accent at all.
That's
And
always
I'm like,
Wow.
I'm like, yeah, because I was like born here. Like I actually have an accent. It's my American accent because I was
Yeah.
born here, you know? And now I notice a lot more people are more open to be like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. They're not as like flabbergasted by it, right? Like I had a meeting with like a manager who has like a very challenging Middle Eastern name, and typically a lot of people when we get on calls mistake his name, and so they'll like fumble it up as they pronounce it. And I remember the last call we were on, there was like a guy who's like a Caucasian who like went out of his way to say, hey, am I saying your name appropriately? Because I want to make sure I'm saying it correctly. And I was like, yeah, like, okay, great. Like, you know, so I think people are starting to get it in some spheres, but there's still plenty of spheres where people are not like,
Yeah.
It's still, you know, like your name's
Yeah, I
Toby,
feel like
but you're brown.
I
You know what
guess
I mean?
right. I feel like I mean I get it. I mean sometimes there is the experiences that you have, but like we just started off this episode with a guy who makes upwards of I don't know $10 million a year, making stupid comments, and
Yep.
and who is a proponent of the people who are marginalized, and he's almost the first person to talk about when there are not enough black coaches in the NFL, and he's done some like good work on some of those things, and sometimes I feel like to an extent he overdoes it on every single issue, but it's just like, wait,
Yeah.
you are that guy who says you care about people and marginalized people, but then you make comments like this. So I guess what I'm trying to get at too is a society, like we as a society, sometimes we say we care about people and we want to do what's right and we want to treat people equitably, but then there's like these other areas where we just like, oh, it's okay to make fun of them, right? We don't look at it. And Toby, I think that's a huge point. Like, man, there was just this like, okay, we have this mutual understanding. We can make fun of these people because maybe let me ask you this before I throw why I think that is, but why do you think that is? Why is it okay to make fun of some people and not others?
There's like the love languages, right? And then there's like the not love languages. Like
which the book
What's
that
the
our wives forced us to read?
Yeah, the Gary Chapman book.
Is it the book that our wives forced us to read before we got married?
Yeah, no.
Just kidding.
No, but like, you know,
they're not
like,
gonna get this far into the episode. Don't worry about
yeah,
it.
no, nobody at this point. No, it's just us talking. No, but like honestly, like there's certain languages that sound better to the ear, I guess, right? Like that's just like commonly known, I guess. The Indian accent, right? It's a mix of British and whatever state you're from, right? Whether it be Malayalam or Hindi or Punjabi or whatever. Like it has like that duh sound. So like when people speak, it sounds like to some people it sounds funny, right? It kind of stems from there. Then there's like the stereotype of like Indians are not that athletic, or Asians are not that athletic, or there's that stereotype of, your food has a pungent, flavor or smell.
Yeah.
Then there's the fact that like most Indians are not like bigger. You know what I mean? Like, We're not all like 6 feet and above. So there's all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then like you get to high school and things like that. And all those things are mixed in with like hormonal high school, boys and girls. And then like it just kind of like goes
The
from
nuclear
there.
bomb waiting to explode.
Yeah,
Yeah, I feel like all of that kind of mixed together like creates this stereotype of like it's okay to make fun of those guys,
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's more to it, but yeah, that's just my perspective. Like that, I feel like that's part of it at least.
But I think every culture has those things, but sometimes maybe we choose to highlight those negative things, right? Like every culture has something that you can tease, right? But part of it too, I feel like, is Asian Americans haven't been in America predominantly in this country as long, right? Compared to like African Americans, and they have a super long history. And
yeah, that's true.
Like looking at the history of, especially oppressed people or folks in the African American community. Now, you wouldn't say those same jokes, especially because the heightened social justice. Because I think when we look at some of those things, it's like, I look at the history, but like to me, I look at it from like a biblical standpoint. Like, no, we should treat everybody in the image of God, like regardless of the history. Like, a lot of the immigrants that have come here around the 50s, after the 50s, 60s. I mean, that's it within our lifetimes, right? Like our generations, our parents' generation. So it's not like this 1800s history that our Asian American populations, even though they were here, building the railroads and things like that. It's like they have a rich history. So maybe it's not as highlighted enough, but I feel like that shouldn't be an excuse. History should not be an excuse of how I should treat somebody, right?
Yeah.
It should be like, absolutely. No, I should be treating everybody like the image of God and like how people should be treated.
But the country's learning, you know what I mean? It's still like, it's still learning. Like in the last like 10 years, it has taken a leap, right? And started learning more because of social media, because of the phones that we have and the cameras and, people being outspoken about those things. So the country is still learning, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it definitely like has to do with, the longevity of, the people who have been here the longest. Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny when we talk about names and like what's in a name and like people having to have American names or Western names, like how many of our friends, and I'm not like saying that that's a bad thing, because I know plenty of my friends and family who've had to have an American name and to say like, well, no, this is my American name. Because maybe, and I'm curious, maybe our listeners out there could tell us, like, if you had to to adjust your name. Actually, my mom was saying this story yesterday when we were at a family member's house. They're like, oh no, you can call me Amy. My name is actually Amal, but just to make it easier on you.
Yeah.
And it was just
I heard that so many times.
Any final thoughts on that? Like, how do we respond as a community? Like when we see those types of things, what should we do when you experience those types of incidents of hate or even bullying or whatever it is? Like, how do we respond to that?
I think we have to let people know that like it's not okay, and like make people aware of what's going on, like we can't just like do the whole model minority of like, putting your head down and be like, it's okay, it's not a big deal, long as it doesn't it doesn't affect my family or whatever it is, but it's affecting other people's families, so I think like being aware of it, talking about things like that, what we're doing, how we're doing now, those kind of things help. Like it's gradual, it's not going to be overnight, but things are going to get better if we speak on it, if we share thoughts on it, if we hear from the people that are being affected. Like those are things that's going to help change the people's minds. And sometimes it takes a generation, but at least it's changing, and that's what we got to do. We got to keep pushing, so yeah.
And I think even a lot of it is like, I think we're in a kind of unique position. Like if I were to encounter that, say maybe someone was like saying something against like an Asian American colleague, right? So it wasn't directly affecting me, but it might be affecting them. then I would probably try to like play both sides. I would talk to the one being offended and be like, hey man, that kind of sucks. Like, you shouldn't have to, like, how does that make you feel? When he like makes funny like that, is that cool, or how do you feel about it? And then also to the people that like are doing it, give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe, I'm like, hey, that's kind of like not really fair the way you talk to them about, the way you speak to them in this way, because although you think it's funny, they probably don't think it's funny. And they probably had a lot of that in their life, And sometimes even just that first step of people you have a relationship with, you can start to build, those experiences where people will be like, oh, yeah, okay, I didn't think anything of it. Like when we were younger, yeah, it's not a big deal to make fun of Asians. If that's like the stereotype they grew up under, then it's like, oh, well, maybe it's actually not kind of fair. Maybe that is kind of mean. Maybe they're not seeing it that way.
Yeah. It's funny to you, but it's not funny to them. And
Yeah,
sometimes we just don't know how somebody else is feeling. I think speaking of, like you mentioned Toby and Alvin, I feel like speaking up for those who are dealing with those types of things, like even in meetings, not just like in this like metaphorical sense, right? Take some time to understand, seek to understand. I think we've said that on this podcast several other times too. I mean, we have to like really understand where people are coming from. But thank you guys for kind of talking through this topic. I hope it gets better, and I hope that we can kind of be the voice for some of those folks, but definitely want to hear from our listeners as well. Check out our voicemail feature on anchor.fm/restoring our city. You can actually check that out and leave us a message. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode. And if you have any comments on, the Asian American violence that's been happening, maybe some stories that or questions for our guys here on the podcast as well, we'll be happy to answer those too. So leave us a message. We'll be happy to check that out. So thanks again, guys. Appreciate you jumping on. We'll talk soon.